John Sheehan, and probably at the time went by Jack, was the founder of the company. I've learned a little bit about him as a man. He was born in New York City, I believe in 1854. Moved to Bradford in 1876. Married Teresa Nolan, which later on became part of the chain of the family. Some of the Nolans worked with various generations of Sheehans and were quite an active part of the company. I think he did a lot of oddball jobs. I think, like most Irish guys, was pretty enterprising. He I think, worked as a blacksmith in a tool shop, making tools and things for the oil fields. He got involved eventually in paving, and ultimately the family, I guess you'd call it, became vertically integrated. Later, my granddad, when Jack went to Oklahoma, they made the bricks and paved the streets of Bradford. And I've seen articles saying that Bradford had the best paved streets in the nation due to the Sheehan bricks. If we really look at the start of when John Sheehan began pipelining, you have to go back to 1886. He and a guy named Barney Kelly partnered up and laid a gas line from the fields east of Bradford, in McKean County they called it, into Bradford, Pennsylvania. And at the time, they'd been using various oils for candle lights for the streets. And so that Bradford became one of the first cities to have natural gas for lighting, street lighting. The following year, John worked on probably the biggest project at the time. It was a line from the same gas fields up to Buffalo, New York, and the first time Buffalo got gas. So unclear whether he ran a company or just worked on the project, but certainly his pipelining goes back quite a ways. In 1903, it was about the beginning of the oil and gas discoveries in Oklahoma. And the Pennsylvania fields were waning, but not dying off. So the work, everybody knew that there'd be a lot of work, and they kept finding one oil field after another in Oklahoma. They thought they'd found the biggest, and a few years later, they'd find Cushing after they found Glenpool, and it just went on and on. So sometime in 1903, he ventured to Oklahoma and started pipelining there while still keeping a presence in Bradford. John had 5 boys and 5 girls, so he had 10 children altogether. Some of them stayed behind at times, some of them went with him and went to Oklahoma. John brought some of his sons, Ray, Frank, Walter Nolan, and John B., who is my granddad. The 5 of them formed the various parts of the Sheehan enterprise at the time. And as near as I can tell, most of the other brothers, except John B., came to Oklahoma at various times and worked. John B. stayed at home because I know my dad was born in 1920 in Bradford. He was there running the brick business and what oil lines they were still doing there. Another son, Walter, I think went to California and started working in the oil field out there, started an oil field tool company, and eventually I think had an oil field drilling company in California, probably in the early 20s. So I think all the family was involved. They worked for, near as I can tell, all the pioneers. Prairie Oil and Gas, Empire Oil, all these companies have merged into bigger companies nowadays. I know that great-granddad worked for Josh Cosden, Harry Sinclair. The neatest name I found is a company called the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company. I bet no other pipeline company today can say that they had that company for a client. I mean, it tells you the time of when they were out there working, that there really wasn't much population there. It was still raw western country. In fact, at that time, probably wasn't even a state. Oklahoma, I think, became a state in 1907. So the family was there starting. They, I think, permanently settled in Tulsa in 1915 or so, a house on Guthrie Street. And I know Granddad traveled back and forth. I know there's a quote that in the Oil and Gas Journal that about 1910, that Said Jack Sheehan had arrived from Bradford, I think this was in December, and he said when he left Bradford, there's 36 inches of snow on the ground. He'd stay in Oklahoma till the bluebirds arrived. I've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence of his trips back and forth. He'd spend some time in Bradford and generally some time in Oklahoma and Kansas, chasing the oil field work. I know he worked in that area. I know he did a lot of work for the Prairie Pipeline Company. I know of some lines, a 12-inch line from Ramona to Caney, but just not a lot of records that we found so far back there. And near as I can tell, he was called the pioneer of laying lines and building tank pads in Oklahoma and Kansas territory. I've also read that he was one of the pioneers of what became to be known as oxyacetylene welding, which was the principal welding technique that replaced the method back then was using tongs and screw pipe together, and it was quite labor intensive. Then eventually they went to devices called couplings, but again, those had to be fitted and bolted. So when welding came along, it was quite efficient, and it really increased the production of pipelining, and John Sheehan was one of the first to use that process. Later on, a different kind of welding took over maybe in the late 20s, but from the mid-19-teens to the late 20s, the process he helped pioneer was the most efficient way of welding pipelines. I found a quote in the Oil and Gas Journal in 1915, and Jack had gone to Kansas City to look for laborers, and he said that despite the fact of paying what he thought was an eminently fair wage of $1.75 a day, which is considerably higher, I think, than everybody else paid, that he couldn't get local people to do the work, that he was having to hire foreigners. And that's quite a thought, because if you fast forward to today, we're still doing that. But I think his idea of foreigners was Irishmen from New York. He wasn't just interested in pipelining where he was. I mean, he traveled, I saw a note, he traveled out to California. And at that time, again, this was probably the late teens, there was a big field discovered in California, I think near Bakersfield. And he said he was quite impressed with the methods. He even witnessed what today we'd maybe call offshore drilling. They were drilling from the edge of the land out under the Pacific Ocean a little bit, slant drilling. It wasn't as sophisticated as today's horizontal drilling, but he came back and became quite impressed with that method. One of the things that became obvious is that the man had excellent character, and that character stamped on all the generations. And if I would, I'd like to read a short note from the New York Industrial Review in about 1903. We're not certain, but this was a company that I said that he worked on, and he had a partner named Patrick McGann, and they were building streets and doing various construction things around Bradford. And so this is the quote. "The firm enjoys the confidence and esteem of a large and constantly increasing patronage. They bring to every undertaking a knowledge of construction and a comprehensive grasp of details that cannot do otherwise than achieve success. They are enterprising and progressive in all their business methods, reliable and responsible in all their dealings, and eminently popular in the business community." And I know from my granddad and from my dad that philosophy carried through the generations of Sheehan, and all of us were brought up that way. All of us were taught that that's the way to do business, and that's the way to grow your business, is to be fair and to be honest with people and work as hard as you can for your clients. John Sheehan died in October of 1921, and I think what really is interesting is a comment in the obituary notice, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read this, because this is the legacy that he left the company. His work carried him into many parts of the field, and wherever he went, he made friends. He was a man of powerful figure and commanding presence, and his personality was commensurate with his bigness. These points of prominence added to a never-failing wit, sound common sense, and absolute honesty of word and deed, gave him a place in the esteem of men that will long remain. He had the absolute confidence of the men with whom he did business, while the men he employed thought well of him because his treatment of them was fair and considerate. Then at the time of John's death, the family all got together, and even though John B. was the oldest son, John B. had diabetes, and the family was worried about his ability to travel and his ability to work the long and tough hours. So Ray Sheehan, who I think was the youngest, took over management of the company, and he was assisted, of course, by John B., by Frank, by Walter, by Nolan, and then and eventually, probably in the mid-30s or early 30s, Joe Horrigan joined the management of the company. He was married to one of the daughters of John, their brother-in-law. Back in the 20s then, starting to get a little clearer. We have records of the company, even payroll records and ledger records. And back then, the spread, what we call spreads today, were called gangs. And even though some of those gangs got to be as large as 150 people, they were quite interesting. The wages were 45 cents an hour for a man, but a team of horses commanded $1 an hour. And a foreman worked for $6.45 a day. So it gives you an idea of where we've come. Today's welders make close to $100 an hour. So long difference. The 20s were quite different. Tremendous boom in the economy. I would say the 1920s probably represent the greatest period of growth for the American economy. And Sheehan took part in that. We built at least 200 jobs that I can tell of. Again, the relationships that we built, this started early. And I'll give you two examples. In the 20s, we laid over 1,500 miles alone for Prairie Pipeline. We also went south and Alabama and Georgia and built a major part of the original system of Southern Natural Gas Company. And I'll tell you a funny little aside. Back when I first started full-time on the company, one of my jobs from Dad was to check the cost basis of all his stocks that he owned. And I did that. It took a little while going through the files, but I finally finished, I thought, and I came to him and I said, "But Dad," I said, "I can't find any cost basis for this company called Southern Natural Gas." And he said, "Oh." He said, "Don't worry about that. They were originally getting started then, and they didn't have any money, so they paid us in stock." So that's how we got the Southern Natural stock. And later on, Southern Natural became a great client. And again, total relationships was how we grew as a company. Relationships like that, where we trusted them that what they gave us was not worthless paper, and that eventually, at least at the time I looked at it, was quite valuable. So handshakes and deals were the way things were done back then. A man could go to a company and talk about a job, not have to have a set of specs or a big set of general conditions. You talk about the job, you negotiate the deal, you'd shake hands on it, and you'd go to work. That's the way work was done for many years, and in that, I think the company excelled because of the honesty and the honorableness of the people involved. This was a decade of growth for the company, and Sheehan certainly took advantage of that, expanding from the oil fields of Oklahoma and Kansas to multi-states. We did over 200 jobs and over 4,000 miles of pipe in the 20s. In the 1930s, obviously, the country experienced the worst economic downturn it's ever had. That affected everybody, including our company. I've read that at one time we were down to one employee, the shop foreman, Glenn Rambo, in Lawrenceville. I assume the brothers were still around, but they weren't considered employees, and they probably didn't pay themselves anything. So how did we survive through that? Near as I can tell, it was tough, like everybody. We struggled. We did do pipeline work, maybe about half as much as the decade before, about 2,000 miles and maybe 100 jobs. We laid the original line for Great Lakes Pipeline. We laid 500 miles for a company called Stanlin in Illinois and Missouri. We went into other lines of business. I can't find a lot of documentation, but I know we laid some electrical lines. My grandfather, John, laid the water line to Southern Hills Country Club in 1936. I know that because we got 2 memberships, one of which eventually came to me. And I found out that we didn't pay anything. We got paid, again, just the way the company was. We did a favor for the country club that was being started. We didn't charge for it, but we got 2 memberships in return. One of the interesting things I found through one of my relatives is that there was always a rumor that the brothers had money stashed away, not in banks, but in mattresses, and that's how they got through the 30s, was with money they'd saved by not putting it in banks or other things. They invested it in the business and obviously kept a little bit of it. And then I'd probably like to end the decade with a little story about a guy named Tuffy Griffith. I've heard stories about this guy, and one of my uncles clarified it a little bit more, but this guy was a superintendent for my grandfather, and superintendent means he ran the crews. Well, Tuffy was probably, as they call him, pint size, which probably means 5'5", and compared to the Sheehans, who were rather big people at times, not very large. But the story was that Tuffy could whip any 4 men twice his size. And the history of the company goes that that's one reason why our spreads were very efficient in those days. And another part of the family lore of the 30s is that in 1939, Ray died unexpectedly and rather young. So the family got together, and John had, of course, been working with the company and still had his diabetes, but was healthy enough to start running the company. So in 1939, my granddad, John B. Sheehan, took over. It's interesting that a couple of years before, my dad, Bob Sheehan, at age 17, started working for the company. So one of the stories he told me will lead us into the 40s. As, of course, the war became more obvious that the United States was going to get involved, and we'd been supporting England by shipping as much oil as we could. And I think a little known fact that I think at that time the United States produced 75% of the oil in the world, and that's why the Germans were trying to go to the fields of the Mideast. But we kept Russia and England alive with our oil, and then of course when we joined the war, oil powered all our ships. The thing that helped us do that was the building of what became known as the Big Inch and the Little Inch. These were 2 pipelines built by the government, the War Emergency Department, from the South Texas oil fields to the refineries in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, so it could be processed and then shipped overseas in tankers. And what had been happening is they'd been doing this shipping from Beaumont or Houston by tanker, and the German submarines were exacting a terrible toil on the tanker ships. So the country decided the best way was to rush these pipelines, and Sheehan was proud to be part of that. I've actually seen the original contract for the War Emergency Pipeline, looked at the wages, looked at the crews. It was essentially cost plus, reimbursed by the government. But as you can expect back then, lots of paperwork. We built 200 miles of it in Illinois and Indiana, at least 3 sections of it. We built 3 pump stations because of our expertise from the oil fields of Oklahoma. And my dad told me the story that, probably when he was 19 or 20, he said, I knew that route like the back of my hand. I drove your grandfather 9 times back and forth across that route, looking at the right-of-way and looking at the work. So, he wasn't hardly eligible to drive, and he was getting ready to go off to war, but he contributed his part to my granddad and our company's part of that great chapter in American pipeline history.
My name is Robert D. Sheehan. I entered the service in October of '42 following Pearl Harbor. I was among the large group of pilots that were first assigned to the 467th when the original pilots were signed to the crews. We left Wendover then in late February 1944 for England and flew our own aircraft, which were brand new model B-24Hs overseas. We were fortunate enough to get through the whole entire war without any injuries on our crew. We felt that we were lucky that we were that. It wasn't because of anything that we were doing. We were just lucky in that regard. We had airplane damage a number of times. I mean, we would get 16, 70 holes in an aircraft, and we came back one time with engine feathered, and we had our control cables severed on one mission over an airfield in northern Germany. We felt that we would probably be back over there fighting a few years after we left anyway, and that didn't happen, of course. It was a job to do, and we set about doing it in what we thought was a proper manner.
Did you have any trouble adjusting to civilian life when you returned to the States?
Not at all. My dad said go to work. and did.
What kind of work did you
follow?
engage in?
Construction business. I had done a little bit of construction with we have a family company, and it started by my grandfather. So I fell right back into that and started becoming involved with it, and shortly thereafter, you might say, handle the management of the company from then on.
So during the 40s is when I think Sheehan truly became a national contractor. We completed 160 jobs totaling 2,500 miles of pipe. We worked in Wyoming. We worked again in the South for our good old client Southern Natural, doing a lot of looping. We worked in Minnesota for a company called Great Lakes Pipeline again. We built a particularly tough job for Sinclair in eastern Pennsylvania. And I think this is the decade that we earned our reputation for being able to complete jobs on time and on budget. And again, I think it goes to the character of the people involved and what they handed down to their workers, is that we could be relied on, that when we gave our word we'd do something, we as Sheehans would get it done. We moved into the 50s with now my father, Bob Sheehan, running the company. His dad lived until 54, so the company basically became Bob Sheehan's in 1945, right after he turned from the war. And now, you know, it's when I start to get a little more involved. Obviously, I was born in 46, so as I started paying attention to what my dad does, as all kids do, I got pretty quizzical, and I could see some of the articles, and I could see maybe things on his desk, models and stuff, and so I kept bugging him, and so one time he took me down to southern Oklahoma near the town of Pauls Valley. The company was installing a river crossing across the Red River, and man, as a kid, that was something. I got to ride on a bulldozer with an old guy they called Hardhead Smith, and despite getting wet, the trip didn't bother me at all. In fact, I was so excited to see the big equipment and mounds of dirt that were certainly a lot bigger than what I'd had back home in my sandbox at home. And I met some interesting characters, and probably at that time I was hooked, even though maybe in college I didn't know it, but till later. But pipelining probably got in my blood at the early age of 8. I started becoming aware of the family business and what it meant. It meant that my father was gone a lot, but it meant a relative degree of comfort. The family, I don't think, would be considered rich, but we certainly were comfortable in the style of the 50s, and I became aware of Dad's business dealings and Dad's reputation, even when I was young, how much people respected my father. You know, he carried on that and maybe even implanted a stronger tradition of relationships. Dad grew a relationship with Buckeye Pipeline that lasted over 20, 30 years. In the 50s, it was particular prominent that he did thousands of miles of jobs for him and maybe had as many as 20 crews working for him at one time. And again, Southern Natural came back into play. The people that we worked for back in the 20s where again the South was growing. Gas was becoming the fuel of choice in the nation. Even in the South, industrial growth in the South was booming. Natural gas was a reason for it. And we worked again, we laid a lot of pipelines for Southern Natural Gas throughout the South. A couple other footnotes on the 50s, just individual interesting jobs. And I remember Dad talking about this one a little bit, is we laid 180 miles of pipe clear across Pennsylvania for Sun Pipeline. And according to Dad, I mean, it's some of the most challenging river crossings anybody's ever installed, and of course, Pennsylvania mountains, again, make that a very challenging job. We also ventured into Canada as a joint venture for interprovincial pipeline with another contractor, so our first border we crossed back then. Capitalizing on the big boom of natural gas that started in the 50s, but really expanded. Extremely high percentage of the cross-country natural gas pipelines that are still in the ground today were installed in the 60s. And Sheehan grew with that. We put in about 3,500 miles of pipe comprising some 195 jobs in about 24 states. So we were truly a national contractor. We weren't the biggest, but we certainly took advantage and the company grew. Bob, my dad, expanded on the relationships he'd had. But those relationships were starting to change. As companies grew and got bigger, the day of the handshake and we'll go do a job for you and we'll worry about what it costs later, or here's the deal up front and we'll do it. Again, now contracts came into play, lawyers came into play, and things began to change. So, the company adapted. The company was certainly able to grow along with that. And at this point, I start to get involved a little bit. Dad, basically, like his dad said, you're going to work. So shortly after I graduated from high school, me and a friend drove up to Wisconsin, and first guy I met was a grease man driving a truck down the road, and he was so covered in grease I couldn't tell who or what he was, but had a Sheehan pipeline sticker on the side, so we led us to the warehouse, and I met Mr. Mulkey, who was one of Dad's superintendents, and became a laborer, working on about any job that they decided that I could do. And it was certainly good for me because I think I gained 20 pounds in that 8 weeks or 10 weeks I was working. One of the stories is one day Mulkey decided that he needed this lateral laid. We were laying 12 and 16-inch trunk lines for Northern Natural Gas all over Wisconsin. And to hook up a little town, they needed to lay about a mile of 3-inch. So he said, you're going with this crew. Well, I pretty much was the crew. It was me and a truck driver, a 75-year-old welder helper, and a welder. So guess who unloaded all the pipe, who held it while the pipe was being prepared to weld, and who held it in place while it was being welded. And these are 40-foot joints of 3-inch. You do 130 to 150 of those in a day's time. I would have liked to have killed Mr. Mulkey, but I couldn't lift my arms to get to him. So that was fun. There was, a couple stories of eating. There's one little chicken place in a little town called Rockville, Wisconsin, which was near the warehouse. Me and my friend ate enough chicken at $1.50 all you can eat that the next year we went back there, the place was gone. So good times working in the summer. I think I was getting paid $3.26 an hour, which for 18-year-old kid was a lot of money back in those days. Went to Notre Dame, and the next summer, of course, back to work. This time out in Colorado on a project for Cascade Natural Gas, which at the time we built that. It was a 14-inch line, about 70 miles long. Was the highest elevation pipeline ever built in North America, some 8,500 to 8,800 feet. And part of that job was a very interesting construction piece. We put pipe down a feature of the geography called Cathedral Bluff, which is a bluff that's 2,300 feet high. I helped install that. In fact, drove a pickup truck, a two-wheel drive pickup truck down a switchback road that about halfway down, my compatriots decided they were going to get out and watch me back it up around the corners. So I had a pretty good first-hand view of Cathedral Bluff, and to put a pipeline down that face of that bluff is truly amazing. Stayed there till early September, went back to school. Mulkey called me and said, "Why did you leave?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "On September 18th, we had 18 inches of snow." I said, "Well, I'm in South Bend. We're going to get that pretty quick too." So, fun stories about working and learning learning the work and learning to appreciate the workers. Those are the people that make us look good. It's hard work. It's long hours, but it's really rewarding that you put something in the ground across many, many miles of terrain through mountains, swamps, timber, rock. It's really challenging work and interesting work. When I got back to college, despite the fact that I might have had an English teacher that was very charming and very interesting, and Chaucer was fun reading, didn't take me too long to figure out that my engineering studies were the one I was going to focus on. And then even then, it didn't take me too long to figure out why was I studying structural engineering, because I was going to be a pipeliner. So I won't say some of my grades were the best, but you know what? I learned with the experience I had in the summertime, the practical experience, and I learned what engineering's about and why you have engineering and how you apply it. And that's the part that appealed to me, not the design necessarily, but the application of it. You actually go build things. And I might have been happy building buildings, but since pipelining got into my blood at age 8, I knew I was going to build pipelines. And from then on, I focused my studies on whatever construction courses I could take, whatever management courses. I was fortunate because Notre Dame taught philosophy and theology. They had a rule back then, no matter what your major was, you had to take one of those courses each semester. The practicality of dealing with people and personalities is really what helped me. I got it from my dad and I got it from the family heritage, but really learning how people think and what makes people do the things they do, I paid a lot of attention to that, and it ultimately helped me in dealing with people and being able to carry on the tradition of the family in terms of honesty and hard work, and your word was your bond. If you told a company you were going to do something, you went out and did it. Some of our work history in the 60s is that one of the biggest jobs we did size-wise was a job for Transwestern Pipeline in the Oklahoma Panhandle and the Texas Panhandle. And this is one of the first jobs that Warren Mulkey ran. He'd worked some for other superintendents prior to that, and Warren became Dad's and mine's general superintendent. But we did 800 miles for this company and hooked up 500 wellheads. I mean, it's quite a program. It's over 2 years. Interesting, we met one of these guys on this job, the guy named Doug Church. He was a young engineer and he was going to night school, and he was working for Transwestern Pipeline. Well, again, lo and behold, years later, Doug Church was running Texas Eastern's transmission division, their construction division, and we ended up doing an awful lot of work for him because he learned then that who our people were, what we could do, and how they could trust us. Ultimately, that relationship led in the 80s to a relationship with me and another fellow that worked for Doug of getting awarded on basically a handshake. Texas Eastern had a couple blowouts, and they had to go test or replace a major part of their pipeline system in Kentucky. So basically on a handshake deal and a rate sheet, we went to work, and that work grew into 8 crews, millions and millions of dollars of work, and ultimately over about a 1.5-year period, we did 1,200 locations, dig out locations or pipe replacements. Some areas they found a lot of bad pipe, and we just started laying the section over the hill to the next valley. But I still think that work, which was very beneficial for us in the 80s and really helped the company solidify our growth, went back to the days of Mr. Church and Mr. Mulkey's relationship in the 60s. Another job that came to mind in the 60s, again, was across Pennsylvania. We did a job, I believe it was for Sun, that was 100 miles long or so, but crossed 12 mountain ranges. And if you've ever been to Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna River is the major river up there, especially flows into Chesapeake Bay, I think. Through most of it, it's solid rock, and places of it, it gets almost a mile wide. And the company picked one of those places for us to put in a pipeline crossing, and quite an impressive feat. Back then, you dynamited the line and installed it open cut, where today you drill it. I've seen a picture of that, and there's certainly an awful lot of dynamite and an awful lot of water going off in that riverbed. But another job that happened early in my career, in the late 60s, early 70s, I think I was still going to school, but the lore of this job in company history is amazing. And Shell Oil came to us, and for something unheard of in the projects east of the Mississippi River, they awarded us 350 miles of 12-inch pipeline basically from Wood River, Illinois to Lima, Ohio. And we finished that job with one spread in one construction season, which is, I mean, you think about it, in the north, you've maybe got 5 or 6 months. So you're looking at, say, 60 miles a month and almost 2 miles a day. It was quite an achievement. Shell was exceptionally happy. The deal they'd made with us was very beneficial for both of us. They knew we could finish it. There were some incentives that we did achieve, and so quite an achievement, and it stands probably today as still the longest single pipeline completed by one spread east of Mississippi River. One of the most unique jobs we had in the 70s was laying a welded steel sludge line. The sanitary district of Chicago had gotten in trouble with where they were dumping the waste sewage, and so they came up with this plan to barge it down the Illinois River to a point, and then we built a dock. We laid a pipeline to an old abandoned strip mine coal field, and they reclaimed the coal field and then spread this sludge on top of it to create some of the best cornfields Illinois has got right now. Probably the first welded sewer line that you could think of, steel sewer line done. And another one, it was also interesting. We did a job for Montana Power that was managed by Bechtel Power. They were building a large coal-fired power plant up near Colstrip, Montana. To get the water to that plant so they can generate electricity, they had to run a water line from the town of Forsyth on the Yellowstone River about 26 miles down to the plant. Normally, water lines are done with concrete or clay pipe. But because of the volume of water they needed and the pressure and the mountain ranges that had to go across, Bechtel designed a steel water line, probably one of the first, if not the first, long-distance transportation of water. Coal tar back then was the coating of choice, but because the water line, unlike oil lines, would have periods of time where the water, they weren't pumping all the time, so you'd have a mixture of air and water. Well, air and water create corrosion, and of course steel corrodes rather quickly when you have that circumstance. So the specifications were to coat this line internally with coal tar, and we could get it from the plant that way except for the joints. So we devised a system to use hand-applied liquid epoxy on the joints that we laid above ground. But that left the problem of when we lowered in these sections, and normally we would lower in very long sections. Because of this, we lowered in maybe 800-foot sections. So we built little manholes with flanges, and this was now, mind you, a 26-inch pipeline. A man got inside that with a little scooter and went back 800 feet with a bucket of hot coal tar. And trust me, the coal tar that we used on the pipeline is a lot hotter than what you see on the roofs around town. And we had 2 Mexicans that did this, and the company was amazed we could get anybody to do this. And the Mexicans got $12 an hour, and they were happy as larks. So we finished that job, and that was, even Bechtel hadn't figured out how we were going to do that. We figured out how to do it and help them get the pipeline in service. I think that makes a pretty interesting first for the company. And again, some of the ideas that come from the field people, and this came from the people out in the field. Also, again, go back to the Buckeye relationship. We got many jobs with Buckeye of not having to bid them. Even in past the day when that was the practice, we still got jobs. And it was just amazing watching Dad, talk to these people or work with them. I got to visit a few of the jobs and listen to maybe the inspectors and even the lower field people, how much they valued what Sheehan did for them. I'll go maybe into a little era of my time frame, and then I'll jump ahead to the 80s. Again, back to our client of Southern Natural. They came to us one year, late in the year, and again, we bid the job, but I think our work plan and our history with them enabled us to get this job. And it was about 90 miles of 20-inch and 30-inch. And we didn't start this job till late September in the south. And I mean, it was getting close to when it starts raining down there. There were 2 major river crossings, one 400 feet across and 30 feet deep, that took a very large dredge to install and many side booms to hold on to the concrete coated pipe section to put it in. Another one over near Columbus, Georgia, was solid rock all the way. Projects were really tough, and we knew the company was really interested in getting it done on time. In fact, the vice president of Southern Natural Gas, senior vice president, came and picked me up in his corporate jet, and we flew to all the job sites, which were 4 or 5, all over Alabama and Georgia, and he wanted to see for himself how the progress was, and it was becoming obvious that it was nip and tuck. And so they asked us, can you put a little more effort into it? And without any kind of deal, we added a couple more crews and ultimately got compensated for those crews. There's a little quirk in this story. I knew it was going to be real close. And Dad had a rule, you didn't work Christmas. Well, December 31st was coming and Christmas was a work day. And I didn't tell Dad this, and I didn't tell Dad this even till he died. Now, he certainly knows it now, but I gave a choice to one of the crews. One crew said they'll work New Year's Day and finish. The other crew said they'd work Christmas Day and finish December 31st. So I talked it over with the superintendents, and that's what we did. And we did finish both those jobs in an amazing amount of time with a very, very happy client. And in their newsletter, internal newsletter, was headlined the completion of that job by year end, thereby saving Southern Natural a lot of money. So, Dad, sorry about Christmas, but that was the tradition of getting jobs done. We did what we had to do. As far as stories specifically about my dad, it'd probably go back to maybe the times that I'd get to go with him to visit clients. And I'd listen to him talk to them, and then I'd see the respect that they had for him. There was a particular guy, Bob Landers, that worked for Natural Gas Pipeline that Dad and I visited a lot, and we did a lot of work for them. We did a tremendous amount of their rehab work and testing work, and a lot of that sure was bid, but I don't think that we were necessarily low bidder all the time. We had an old superintendent that we got from another company, and with him came some of their business, but we were able to grow that business where we did hundreds and hundreds of miles of testing in the 60s and 70s for this company when it became real important to start rehabilitating these pipelines that had been laid years ago. And the respect that my dad had from that company and from Mr. Landers made an impression on me. Mr. Landers was a real straight shooter himself, and I could see the way Dad and Mr. Landers dealt with each other, and I knew that when it became my turn that that was what I was going to have to emulate. You know, what I got from my dad, and when I learned that, was maybe he'd take us to pipeline conventions. And, you know, there were certainly bigger contractors around, but there was certainly an aura of respect for my dad. And it didn't take long to figure out why. That Bob Sheehan was as honest as anybody there, and that his company was very well respected for the way they treated their foremen, their people. And these are rough and tumble competitors, but the pipeline industry is a pretty good camaraderie of people. We compete like hell against each other. And I learned that from those people, how well respected Dad was in terms of how he carried on his business and how his clients respected him, and eventually how maybe even feared Sheehan was because of the way we did work. And you know, that's something I learned, and I'd say that later on I carried that to the fullest extent I could, that I wanted to be the contractor that other contractors were jealous of. How can you do work for that price? I remember something that Dad always kept on the corner of his desk was a little cartoon. And there was what was obviously a contractor tearing up papers and throwing them in the trash can and cussing, visually, how did that so-and-so beat us? He's bidding below our costs. And the caption on the bottom of the cartoon was, he may not be bidding below his cost. And I learned that from Dad. I learned that you constantly need to push people and motivate people. And again, that comes back to the courses I took at Notre Dame. How do you do that? What do people want? And so I got that from my education, but I also got that from watching the esteem that my dad was held in, and then listening to the stories about my grandfather and my great-grandfather, and even reading some of these stories. I said, this is a tradition that's been entrusted to me, and this molded me and helped me carry it forward when it became my turn to run the company.